glad you're here. As you know, this is a series where we try to talk and explore challenges that we encounter in our writing projects. And we started this early this year. We had some students here. We had Professor Burkter, Professor Neufeld, Professor Varzelli. And today we are lucky to have Professor Fousekis, who is not only an accomplished author and historian, she's also the director of the Center for Oral and Public History. And I'm sure that all of you know her personally or know about her. And she, I am sure, has a lot more variety in her writing experience than many of us have, because she has written grants in the past, and in her experience as the director for the center, she has also authored projects. And I think that writing is probably quite different in style than what you have as an academic. So let's welcome Professor Fousekis. Hello, Professor Fousekis. And I'm going to call you Natalie because I can't maintain that switch because we've known each other for 20 years.
As long as you don't mind me calling you Volker, we're all good.
That's also fine, yes. Okay, so you have all seen Professor Fousekis' biography on our website. And you can see here that in the 25 years of her experience, she has dealt with the written word in a variety of ways that I think really renders her an expert on how to write effectively as a scholar and also as a professional. For those of you who will not become academics, and there's a number of you, figuring out how to write effectively, not just history, but about anything, I think that's an important skill that we try to convey. So I think with that, I want to turn to questions, and I'm going to ask Professor Fousekis some questions, and then in the conversation, I hope you guys will take some notes and maybe have some questions as well. So first I want to ask you, Natalie, what motivated you to become a writer, or what got you interested in writing?
So I guess this will be a little bit different maybe than some academics, but I have to say that I actually hated writing for a long time. And I always felt like writing was challenging for me, and I didn't really enjoy the process. This is, of course, when I started graduate school. But what I did love is I loved history for the people and the stories that we can tell with the research that we conduct. And so I think what got me excited about writing history initially was taking research that I had done in the archives, and especially the more engaging primary sources, and trying to contextualize those and provide, an argument that historians would, find persuasive to look at a particular period in time. And when I started, I was not an oral historian. I was not even a historian of women, which is my expertise now, although I was a historian of politics and policy. So the first article I ever wrote was actually about the Vietnam War, a long time ago. And so I think what really finally got me excited about writing was when I started doing oral history. And I guess that kind of goes into your second question.
I wonder whether you can actually share a little bit more about the ways in which you didn't like writing, because I don't think you're the only one who is not necessarily a naturally born writer who, wanted to write in their diaries every day and, enjoyed essay assignments in school. I think that's a small number. So do you have memories of how writing was maybe a dread or a challenge? Or
yeah, I mean, I think that part of it was that I enjoyed the analytical side of creating a historical argument, right? Finding the, reading the primary and secondary sources, selecting the evidence for the argument I was going to make. But then when I would get to the point where I had to take that and sit down, I would just feel like I was writing garbage. I mean, some of it's the general like imposter syndrome, but also I think it was that at least when I went to college even, I don't think they really spent a lot of time teaching you about the craft of writing as a historian. And, if you could write a good paper using good primary sources and, it might not be super exciting, but it got the job done, you could still get a really good grade. So I think it was in graduate. And also just literally staring at the blank. In those days, I started on paper because, it wasn't until the middle of my graduate school that really, I started thinking about composing actually on the computer.
I have this that I have a storyline or a story or an argument in my head, and it's crystal clear in my head, but then I have to sit down and write it on paper, and somehow that doesn't happen in the same way. And I could imagine a lot of students feel the same way. That it's clear as up to the point that you sit down and want to write it. So why was oral history different there for you?
So I think number one given what I study, I actually in college was deciding between becoming a political scientist and becoming a historian. But the difference for me was that political science didn't have any of the people in it, and history had the people in it. So oral history takes that up to the next level, right? You don't just get to read about the people and what the people wrote, but you actually get to talk to the people and ask them the questions that you want to ask them, not just whatever they wrote in the diary or whatever you're reading in a, city council minutes or congressional record, that you could actually ask them the questions that you're interested in having them reflect on. And then, I like the idea of having people who are not famous in the stories that I tell. So the best way to get to those people is to conduct oral histories with them.
Now, in your oral histories, you write questions, obviously. Do you ever get so caught up in the interview that the questions sort of fall to the wayside, and then was the writing of the questions of secondary importance?
No. Sometimes I get caught up and will stop thinking about my questions because what they're saying is so interesting and engaging, and then I'll ask follow-up questions that are not on my question list. But number one, the act of writing the questions helps me solidify and think about what it is that I hope to ask them about. And then, a lot of times the questions are so open-ended that, I don't know where they're going to go with the answer. And so that's why, I try to write the questions as open-ended as possible so that it's not me looking for a particular answer, it's them going wherever they want to go. But, so a good oral history interview, I'm not just going through and kind of checking off my list of questions. Sometimes they're answering my questions while they're, they might answer 4 of my questions in one question I asked them. But if it's, sometimes I might jettison the question altogether if we've moved on and I didn't think it was particularly critical, but I'll always go back if I thought it was something that was important. But the act of writing the questions is really, and preparing the questions and putting them in some kind of order really is as much about the preparation for the interview itself as it is about actually asking those questions, I think. So.
Now, your major publication, your monograph, was based on oral history research as well, correct?
Yes. And I would say that if I had not done the oral histories, the book wouldn't have happened in the way it happened, and I don't think it would have told the story that I told in a way that really helped the reader understand the perspective of these working class women who wanted childcare in California. And that, for me, I used the oral histories, you know, we talk about something in oral history called shared authority, and I didn't, you know, let the people I interviewed write the book, but I did give them voice, not just a voice of, oh, I'm going to insert a quote from your interview here, but actually letting them, having them teach me what was important about what I was writing. In other words, in my conclusion, the conclusion of the book, I really turned to their takeaways from what they did, not necessarily, you know, I set a little bit of context, but I let them tell us what we should conclude from this, you know, 25-year movement for childcare in California.
Mm-hmm. Oral history, and I know this from having done some interviews for you at COF, is very much about relating to the people that you, or not necessarily relating, but connecting or building a connection to the people that you're talking to. And inevitably, it becomes as much about the moment that you're sitting down as it is about their memories, what they share. Could you ever see yourself writing history about the early 19th century? Or we have colleagues that, you know, work in the early modern period. Could you conceive of doing that ever? Or is this connection to the people of the present really central to you?
I mean, look, my book that I wrote I spent months and months in the archives. So if somebody said, you can't be a historian anymore unless you write about the 19th century, I could do it. But I think I would get slightly less enjoyment. I think I would try to find the people in diaries and other ways that you can get at people's sort of thoughts. But the actual, you know, interviewing of people, you know, at a certain point, I felt a responsibility to the women that I had interviewed to write their story, because if I didn't write it, nobody would. Mm-hmm. And it was because I still keep in touch with, from that original project, one of the women I interviewed, but from my most recent project, you know, I email with 6 or 7 of the women I've interviewed, and I haven't written anything yet, but they are the ones that keep me wanting to write it if I could ever carve out the time. So I wasn't fundraising or doing other things for the center.
Now, the people that you interviewed for your book, those were people that I think you had a personal connection to as well. These were activists for you know, some important basic rights and means to equalize opportunity. But you have also interviewed people that, let's put it nicely, are somewhere very different on the political spectrum, right?
Right.
Do you feel a similar connection when you interview those narrators? I
mean, yes, actually, as human beings, I do. I don't know that I've ever interviewed anybody who I found their views, you know, completely repulsive to me, you know, that I couldn't even stand. But I have interviewed, you know, a few of my students are on this session right now. It's no surprise that I'm a, you know, left-leaning political thinking, but I'm also somebody who's really wants the center to make sure we have all the stories from all the different perspectives. And so I've interviewed lots of Republican women, and I think there's always something I can find to connect with them. I've told the students this story before, but I interviewed this woman, Maureen, for the El Toro project. You know, when I sat down and we were getting ready, you know, I had driven, it was in the Bay Area, and I had driven from my dad's house in Berkeley. And, you know, she said something while I was setting up the recorder, like, well, Natalie, you and I have nothing in common politically. And I said, oh, well, what do you mean? You know, and she said, well, I'm a rah-rah military wife, and I am a Republican, and you are from Berkeley, you know. And so thankfully it was not my first interview, because I might have been a little unnerved by that. And you know, I just said, look, I'm a women's historian. You were a woman in the Marine Corps, and we have the same goal here, which is that the stories of women in the Marine Corps need to be told. So it doesn't matter who I'm going to vote for president or you're going to vote for president. That's, you know, irrelevant. So, you know, and I can connect to her story as a human being. And frankly, given in the divided world that we're living in today, you know, if everyone could do an oral history of somebody that they are of the opposite political beliefs, it might help them find ways to agree, even if they disagree on some of the major issues.
I asked this because it occurred to me that this kind of connection to a shared humanity is something that other historians could actually learn from oral historians, in the way in which we, when we do this, engage much more deeply with the person on the other side of the microphone. And I remember having done interviews for you for the El Toro project, where an old lady, an enthusiastic, at the time it was Tea Party, an enthusiastic member of the Tea Party movement, took me to the side and told me with a sense of confidence about how the Jews were really at fault. And she thought, me as a German, you know, we could bond over this. And I held my tongue, which was challenging. But at the same time, as she was talking about her life and age, you could see where her pain came from. And while she turned this into something completely counterproductive and destructive, there was nonetheless a connection. My neighbor was a birther, or is a birther, and someone who believed that Obama is an illegitimate president born in Africa. And I interviewed him for the project, and after 3 hours, we had built a connection that allowed us to actually be good neighbors in a way I would have never thought possible. And I'm thinking maybe if oral history could model this for the way in which we engage our documents too, for those who are not alive, that'd actually be a good step.
Yeah.
Now, when you wrote that book, you of course had to turn all of this into a monograph. And I don't see, I mean, do you think writing a book with oral history is somewhat easier, or it has its own, it has a more predetermined organization than another monograph?
No, especially because I wasn't really doing one that was only driven by oral history. So in other words, I had to figure out where did these women I interviewed fit into the story I was telling. There was some oral history in every chapter, but there were 2 chapters that had a lot less oral history in them than the others, and they were really much more heavily based in the documents that I had. But what was, I guess, freeing or, allowed me to think creatively is I decided to focus one of my chapters on 2 women. And, my book was organized generally chronologically from, World War II to the early 1970s. So I really told the story of the 1950s to, with these 2 women as a biography. And one was the leader of the parents who were fighting for childcare, and the other was the woman who was sort of leading all of the childcare teachers and educators pushing for this childcare program. And I wasn't sure. Luckily, I had an advisor in grad school that was very much about, you need to do all the good history work, but if you don't tell a good story, no one's going to be interested in what you're writing. So, you know, and allowed me to sort of take risks. And I had seen somebody else do this in a monograph. And so at least I knew somebody who had published a book had successfully tried this. And so the oral histories allowed me to, you know, dive into their biography in ways that I couldn't if I hadn't done the interviews, and allowed me to sort of think about how can I use, you know, as a narrative tool, two women. They weren't telling the whole story, but I used their sort of relationship and their lives to tell the story of these activists during this particular time period.
You remember a case or an example where you took some risks for the benefit of having a better story?
I mean, I don't know. I wrote some things in some drafts that I wasn't sure if the narrators would like what I wrote. And the ones that I had a good relationship with and that I, you know, some people passed away while I was writing the book. It took me a long time, like most of us, for our first book. So, but the two women that I was, you know, had been in sort of constant contact with, in the draft of my book that was part of my dissertation, I showed it to one of the women, and I told a story about her getting pregnant. She told me in the interview on a one-night stand during World War II, and that's how, because she ended up being a single mom. And I had the kind of very detailed story that she told in the oral history in the book, and she did not want it in there, even though I thought the story explained a lot. I figured out a way to tell that part of the story without, with respecting her wishes and taking out that particular segment from her interview. And then the other one was a woman who I characterized her mother as a communist, and I wasn't making this up. Her mother had, you know, been a member of the Communist Party in the right around the end of World War II, when you could be a member of the Communist Party and not before you could be seen it, and then was of course red baited after that. And she said, do you really have to call my mother a communist? Even though she'd seen her FBI file, she knew she was a communist. And I said, well, here's why it's important to history for me to do this, since, you know, I'm not you know, you told me she was a communist. So, and then once I explained to her why I thought it was important for the history story that I was telling, she was okay with it. So.
It happens quite a bit with oral history, right? That people talk to you in confidence and tell you a lot of things, and then you turn around and want to use that, and they're shocked to see that on paper. Right.
And then also they're shocked. Sometimes I think that how you interpret their lives might not be the same way they interpret their lives. Mm-hmm. So that's another thing to.
Yeah. I guess that's a disadvantage of oral history, that you have these, that you need to wrestle with these contests, which you don't need to do with the deceased. Yes. Right. Yes. When you wrote the book, did you have a successful writing process, a routine, where you
yes.
could? Yes.
Tell us. I'm a morning person, although now that, you know, and before I had kids, it was a lot easier to have my morning, and thankfully I got most of my book done before Henry was born. But you know, I would get up early, whether it was when I was working on the dissertation or when I was working on revising and adding new material to turn it into a book. Get up early, drink my coffee, and really hit the writing first. My brain always has felt like it is, you know, the words flowed easier for me before noon. So I would, in times when I had a grant to work on the book full time, or I was working on my dissertation full time, I would write in the morning, and then I would do other aspects of the the book in the afternoon for the dissertation, whether it was going through new, notes and research for what I was going to do the next day, or I could revise sometimes writing I'd already done, but new writing, for sustained new writing, I had to write first thing in the morning. And so when Henry was born, the one part of my book, since he was born prematurely, that didn't happen, was the conclusion. So the conclusion was written between 4:30 a.m. and 6:30 a.m., when he was 2 years old or whatever, so that and then I would just do that every day until I got it done.
Did you give yourself targets where, in terms of like pages, or does that not work for you?
I am not. In graduate school, I needed the writing group. Like I need some kind of deadline. So, I'm definitely, when you get down to the procrastination, I'm definitely in the procrastinating. I can procrastinate until I feel like I have to do it. So I do a lot of thinking but for me, so I didn't have like a page number. I did know that I needed to accomplish certain things for my dissertation, in the year when I really drafted, and then when I was revising, the same thing. I revised this chapter over this amount of time, etc. But one of the things, and I'm pretty sure you know this book, but Anne Lamott's book, Bird by Bird, which is a book about writing. Do you know that book, Wolfgang?
Don't.
Oh my God, you need to know this book.
Thank you.
See this? Right here.
Now I'm embarrassed.
Old. It's really old, but it has a chapter that whenever I would have a hard time, I think it's the third chapter, it's called Shitty First Drafts. Excuse my language, everybody. And that chapter was to me the most helpful thing I ever read to get me writing. So Anne Lamott she's actually a novelist / essayist, but this book she wrote on writing, even though it's not really meant for nonfiction writers, I found to be really helpful for thinking about the craft of writing. And so I don't know, that particular chapter I read and reread and read and reread and pulled out anytime I was having a hard time. The argument basically is that just write, right? Don't worry about, even for me, then it was like, don't worry about where the exact piece of evidence is. Don't get caught up in trying to find that note you had somewhere that has that piece of evidence or the document at the moment. Put the placeholder in and just get the basic narrative out, when you're trying to start something in particular. So.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, that sounds like good advice. My kids, when they write now, they're always obsessed with formatting. If a word is in Calibri and it should be in Times New Roman, that's the first on their to-do list. I think it's the opposite approach.
Yeah.
Do you create a certain environment for yourself? Like, do you play music, or does it need to be absolutely quiet?
No, it doesn't have to be quiet. I wrote a good chunk of my dissertation and my book in cafes or on the first floor of the library. I'm a social person. Doesn't mean I have to be talking to people, but I just like to be around people. And the good chunk of the time I was writing my dissertation and my book, I lived alone. So I liked the act of going somewhere so I would put in headphones and listen to classical music, maybe some kind of singer-songwriter, as long as the words were not too, nothing distracting. But a lot of times it's classical music that would block out the conversation at the table next to me, but I could still feel like I was around people.
At which point would you share any writing with others for feedback? Because that's an important part, right?
Yeah, it depends on what I was writing and who I was sharing it with. So, and I was part of a great writing group in graduate school. There were about 5 of us in this dissertation writing group, and I know I would have had a really hard time finishing. So I would get a draft of a chapter. It might not be totally complete, but almost complete. And then I would share it with them. Would it be like, oh, I think I could turn it into my dissertation advisor? No. But, you know, to these trusted group of graduate students who I knew were, you know, and sometimes I knew it wasn't I didn't feel particularly good about it. And then they would help me figure out why I had that feeling, right? And how do I, you know, what parts did they like and what parts, you know, didn't work for them for whatever reason, and how might I, you know, move forward from there. So.
How much revision do you do?
Well,
I mean, if the guide is shitty first drafts, then it sounds like you have to do a lot of work in the second round.
Yeah, I would say, you know, well, to get from the first draft that I wrote of a chapter that was part of my dissertation to the, you know, final manuscript that I turned into my publisher, those chapters probably went through 10, 15 revisions a piece easily. Mm-hmm. And, you know, reordering and cutting and yeah, if you take, you know, shitty first draft as your starting point, nobody wants their book to be an entire book of shitty first drafts. So you know, you have plenty of room to go. But for me, the feeling of, oh, I've got 5 pages, even if I don't feel great about it, it shut down the part of me that didn't feel great about it and just allowed me to, you know, that's what that chapter she wrote about, is just keep writing. Mm-hmm. And you will be able to help yourself figure it out.
Are you a ready cutter? I mean, do you readily cut things out and delete it? Or is that a difficult step for you?
It depends. When it was cutting out because the publisher wanted me to cut words, that was hard. Because I felt like that what I turned in felt really good to me. So to have to cut words, that was more challenging. But in the beginning, you know, there were things that I just, you know, oh, this paragraph doesn't need to be here anymore, because I've either figured out a different way to tell this, or it doesn't seem relevant because I found some other better research to use or whatever.
I think that may be one other benefit of the shitty first drafts approach, that if you write the paragraphs with relative efficiency and speed, then it feels less painful to toss them out again if they are not useful. And I think there's a lot of students who really wrestle with this. If they worked hard on a page or two, it's difficult to admit that it wasn't good and you have to toss it. And then they linger on, and then they decide to squeeze it in a footnote as a commentary, and just won't let go. So I think the willingness to cut and delete is actually, it takes some growing up as a writer to do that.
Yeah.
How do you do your outlines? We always tell our students that they need to do outlines. Do you write thorough outlines, and do you write them on paper or computer, or not at all?
No. So, I mean, I think, as I've told you before, in the most, you know, besides since I wrote my book, most of what I've been writing since then is grants and a couple short writing pieces or talks that I've given kind of more for the general public. And in that case, I'll usually sketch out, maybe not like a, you know, Roman numeral 1, A, B, C, none of that. I used to do that back in the day, but I do sort of write bullet points or take notes about the key things that I want to talk about. And then initially they're not in any particular order always. I sort of just make a list of everything that I think I want to put in the grant or the talk or the piece I'm composing, and then after I have that, then I put them into some kind of order. And then, you know, I think the parts that I always enjoy the most is then figuring out how to put the people into the history. And even in the case of grants, how you talk about, you know, so I'm mostly writing grants for oral history. So how do I talk about the people that I want the money for to do the oral history project?
Yeah, and I think that's where you really have, there's a lot you can teach us there in a little bit. I wanted to ask you about note-taking. Do you take notes during interviews, or is there not the time for that?
I do not take notes during interviews, except if I want to sketch out a follow-up question, then I, you know, will write that down. Otherwise, the interview is being recorded, so there's really no reason for me to take notes beyond just sort of sketching. And maybe I'll write down 2 proper names so that I can ask for the spelling at the end. But otherwise, I feel like note-taking during an interview distracts from my ability to be the, you know, good listener.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What note-taking advice do you have for students that work in archival collections?
Well, I mean, I'm going to date myself, but, you know, when I first started my research, I did it on index cards, right? Way back in the, you know, mid-90s or whatever. And then by the time I got sort of to revising my dissertation, I was using FileMaker Pro. I don't know what I would use now if I started a new book project. I don't have one going. And what you know, if I was going to the archive, I would take notes on things that didn't seem substantial. And then I spent a lot of money. Thankfully now you could scan with your phone or your iPad, but I spent a lot of money on buying photocopies of things. Especially if I was traveling to an archive that I knew I couldn't go back to again. So I did take notes, but I would balance the note-taking with the photocopying. And then I have done some research for a project that, you know, someday I hope to get off the ground in the city archives here in Los Angeles. But in that time, I took notes on my laptop, just in a Word doc, and then took lots of photos of documents with my iPad, purely because I didn't want to spend the amount of time that it would take to take the notes in the archive itself. I just would assess, is this a document I want to use? If so, then I'm going to take a picture of it, and then I'll take more notes when I get home. And then most of the notes that I took were about where those documents came from, or maybe there was a little tidbit that was in a document that I didn't feel like I needed to take a picture of.
Yeah, I mean, for students right now, this is sadly not an issue because they don't get to go into any archives in person. But when that day comes again, yeah, time is of the essence. And I remember plenty of times where at the time they didn't allow photographs to be taken, and you really had to think very hard about what notes to take and how to make that most efficient. So I think right now most archives are much more generous with this and allow you to use your smartphone as long as you don't work with a flash.
Yeah.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about your writing of projects. And here I'm actually talking about oral history projects. There's a difference there in writing an oral history project than a historical monograph. What's the key difference, you think?
Well, I've really only written 2 things. I mean, I've written summaries of my projects where I've done lots of interviews, and then I've written a couple things where it's been more about the interviews themselves. And I mean, the one key difference, and especially in the world that we live in today, is if you write something using oral histories and it can be published online or have an online component to it, then the beautiful thing is that people can actually listen to the oral history, not just have to read the words, right? So, and that really makes a lot, in my mind, really allows the power of the oral history to come through in ways that even if I write it beautifully, is not going to come through on the page.
Yeah.
And then I think the other challenging thing is if you want to take a large group of oral histories, you know, and turn them into some kind of maybe thematic monograph, but that's different, you know, like more just like an organizing of the interviews around a theme, which I've thought about. It's a much harder project to structure, and that's why I really haven't done it. I think the things that I would want to do off the recent oral histories I've been doing about women in politics in the region are much more going to be a mixture of oral history and regular documentation, you know, archival work.
How do you write a grant?
Well, let me just preface this. I wrote a lot of, so before I wrote grants for the center, I wrote a lot of fellowship applications for myself, for turning my dissertation into a book. And there was a pretty significant rejection rate for a while there for me. And I had to learn in that process how to write about my, you know, academic monograph for a wide academic audience, i.e. not just a group of historians, but a group of educated members of different fields in the humanities and social sciences, right? And when I finally got my ACLS to give me a year to work on my book, you know, that was probably the 5th or 6th draft of, you know, the overview of my book project. And it to everything from feedback from previous grant agencies to sharing it with new people who'd have been successful on different kinds of grants to see what they thought, you know, I needed. So you have to figure out how to write about it in a way that tells about the, you know, importance of the project you're doing to your academic work, but speaks to issues in a way that engages somebody who could be, I mean, if you're sometimes even on campus, if you're writing certain grants, you could be, a biologist could be reading your, you know, application for some kind of small grant. So, you know, how do you write it so that, you know, an educated person understands and is engaged with what you're doing and thinks that this is a project worth funding?
Do you find it more challenging than, say, regular academic writing?
Yes and no. It depends on the grant. So I've written 2 large National Endowment for the Humanities grants, you know, where you're turning in 96 pages of documentation and, you know, 25 single-spaced pages. Those are really hard to write, especially if you're not an expert in everything. Actually, I've written 3 of those now. But what I learned, the first one that I wrote, we didn't get funded. The second one I wrote, we did. And the third one I wrote, we didn't get funded. So, you know, I had to figure out, so the one that I got was about the center and explaining the importance of the Center for Oral and Public History to the humanities, our collections to the humanities, but also to our students. How was a grant from them to help us build this new center going to allow us to provide people access to the stories in our archives, but also to allow us to have students take those stories and bring them to the public in new and innovative ways. And that was a big, you know, 25-page narrative about the history of the center, what it's in our collection, what I thought people who are reading an NEH grant would think were important about what's in our collection. And then what I thought they would think was important about what we were going to be able to offer our students in this new space. And so in some ways it's easier because you have a limited amount of, you know, they give you a checklist of everything you have to include. And so, you know, you include those things. They take NEH grants are a lot of work especially if you're not going to get them, you know, like
that's most of the time.
Yeah, the one that Dr. Brown Cornell and I wrote, we worked on in some level for 2 years. Some of it was just creating the partnerships for the public history portion but then the writing of the grant, you know, we still worked on it for 3 or 4 months and we didn't get funded, and it was brutal, you know, so, but the Haynes Foundation, which is the other major grant that I've gotten, their major research grant is a 10-page double-spaced document, which was a lot less work, still a lot of work because you had to, you know, explain why everything you wanted the money for was important in 10 pages or less. But, you know, it's not 2 years worth of work. So if you don't get the money, you're not crying for days.
I guess to some extent, this is something that, you know, will be an experience that that any grad student will also go through if they apply for dissertation grants and fellowships and the like. That you have to put yourself out there, and the chances that you put in a lot of work and don't get funded are quite high.
Yep, and I would say this one thing is just don't give up, right? Because if you keep writing and you believe in what you're trying to do, and, you know, eventually you might be successful. And what I've found is once you get some money, then people seem to want to give you more money. You know, like I've proven myself, right, that I can manage a big grant, carry out these big oral history projects, and then people are more willing to, you know, this NEH that we didn't get was the first grant I hadn't gotten in a long time. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And, you know, I don't know what that's about, but I think part of it is just learning how to, you know, contextualize what you're doing for a broad audience.
If you have a checklist to sort of respond to in your grant, does it become harder to make the grant sound engaging? Because when you write an essay freely, you can make sure that you can open with a vignette. It can be lively. You can, especially with oral histories, you can get like the dialogue in there, or you know, it can be rich in quotations and can be quite captivating to read. And that's one of the things I think that students love about history, that actually in comparison to other disciplines, we are a pretty good read overall. But grants, is it harder to make them a fun read to generate?
I mean, yes and no. I think that look, I love the NEH, and I've sat on their, I've evaluated grants for them before, but, you know, what they make you write and how they make you write it sometimes really feels not natural. Like they have these particular categories and you have to check them all off and do them all, right? So sometimes I would feel like I was repeating myself because it seemed like you still had to mention this particular thing in one area, but then they also kind of wanted you to address it in another area. The Haynes Foundation gave you guidelines, but the guidelines were very general. And I found that to be much more freeing. I still couldn't use, you know, vignettes and quotes because you don't have time in 10 pages double spaced to, but you could give examples that amplify the points that you're making, right? So when I got the big Haynes grant for my Women, Politics, and Activism project, I was able to use examples of why, basically the argument I was making was there are a huge swath of stories missing from Southern California if I don't do this oral history project. And I was able to demonstrate by having done a few already, what I was allowing to fill in, and then the possibility, provide the possibility. So I was able to provide interesting examples, and, talk kind of more freely in that. And I kind of prefer those to the NEH.
Well, then writing becomes so functional, like a report. I think we talked about your challenges with procrastination already, so I don't want to belabor that point.
I mean, I would just say that, if you write, it's part of the process at some level. Some people are, there are people, and I know you and I know them, Volker, who could they have that, like, I'm writing a page a day, or I must, I'm disciplined and I write it, whatever, for an hour every day, no matter what's going on in my life, no matter how many young kids I have, no matter how many papers I have to grade. I'm not that person. I address whatever's immediate in front of me. And as the director of the center, that usually means not writing. So it's, so to carve out space to write a grant even sometimes could be hard.
Yeah, you can't always afford to switch off your email and your phone and close the door and say, don't bother me for 6 hours.
And that's, again, why the morning thing, even with kids now, when I really have to write something, I will, and I know you're a morning person too, but,
yes.
I'll get up at 4:30 in the morning and my partner will think I'm insane.
Yeah.
And I will go downstairs in the dark and write for 2.5 hours. Even if, it's just a paper that I'm going to give at a conference, whatever it is. If I have to write, it's better for me to do it before there's lots of people on email.
Yeah. Yeah. I remember we once drove to the Ronald Reagan Library, and I think I got the time wrong or something. And so we ended up at a coffee shop in Simi Valley, I think at 6:45.
Yeah, right.
That was slightly miscalculated. What kind of writing tips do you have for students? The kind of things you would put in a note and stick to your screen.
I mean, for me, the biggest barrier to writing was always my inner critic. The part of me that, even though I've been a historian for however many years, still the little bit of imposter syndrome that lurks around in all of us. Maybe we have colleagues who don't ever have that, but so, I think just for me, just write, right? Just sit down and write. The other thing I've tried are these, when I used to teach the grad writing seminar, just free writing, where you turn, you dim your screen so you can't even see what you're writing, which can lead to all kinds of typos and such. But just write for 20 minutes straight, whatever's in your brain that is going to help you, if you're really challenged with something. And then, everyone here is going to think that I love to say the word shit, but basically, like, just to, print it out after that, circle the ideas that are good, and use those as a basis for, a more structured piece of writing. In other words, if I'm having a really hard time, I will try that on my computer, or because I learned how to write, by hand first. I sometimes, if I'm having a hard time writing something on the computer, I will literally just pull out a piece of paper, because there's something about switching your brain to a different mode that allows me to write that paragraph easier on a yellow pad.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Professor Neufeld shared that advice. He does his first draft on paper because he feels less inhibited than when he has to put things on a screen.
I do think there is that, and that's why I think that the dimming of your screen till it's dark, while it can be a little bit, you end up with some wonky stuff happening, formatting and typo-wise, but it can allow some, in my mind, and I don't remember who I read this from. It was one of, again, another writing book that I, used in my early days. It allowed me to be more creative with my ideas and not worry about whether it was a good idea or a bad idea by seeing what the words look like on the screen, right? And then instead you just write it all and then print it out later, and you know, you look at it and go, oh, that's crap, but oh, that's actually not a bad idea. I'm gonna, you know, keep that. And then, oh, that's good too, but this other thing is, you know, I don't know what I was thinking there. Take that out, and you know, that's, you have the beginning of a, you know, chapter or a couple pages in a paper you have to write, whatever the, you know, so.
Has there ever been a time where you would walk around with a, I don't know, a notepad and pen in your pocket in case things came up
when
for you?
I was really engaged in either my book project or my dissertation, I kept a notepad by the bed, because I would often wake up in the middle of the night when I was really working on it, like day and night. Because back in the days when I didn't have kids, I would just, when I was really like, I would just, you know, when something was due, I would work on it day in, day out. And then I would be waking up in the middle of the night with ideas or even sentences or, you know, quote I wanted to use. And I learned quickly that if I didn't write it down, by the morning you forgot what that idea was, you know, or I'd been working through some problem. And then I, even a few times, have been driving from point A to point B, and I, you know, it used to be one of those little pocket recorders I would just carry in the car with me and talk ideas into the recorder. Or I, you know, at one point I was trying to write part of my dissertation. I had to drive from DC back to North Carolina, and I think I wrote 4 or 5 paragraphs just by dictating it to myself in the car, because I was on a part of the freeway that was, you know, long and quiet, not like driving in LA where you have to worry about all kinds of crazy drivers, you know, and it was just a straight shot, and I would just dictate, and then I would type it when I got back.
Yeah, guys, by the way, those recorders are still available there. Maybe I guess we all have one on the phone now.
Yeah, we can use your phone.
I have one next to the bed because I always encourage my wife to record me at night so I can finally find out what my snoring sounds like. Because everyone tells me you have to be there, and I don't ever know. So I think one of what you said, this you know, when things come to you in your sleep, I think that's a product of real deep immersion. If you have that luxury to really sort of enclose yourself and spend many hours with it until, you know, you go to bed, and then things can actually, I've had this happen, that things come to you in your dream. You actually dream about your writing, and solutions come up that way. But of course, that's that can be a luxury to get these hours of solitude.
Yeah, that hasn't happened as much since I have kids.
So that's why we get up at 5.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. Any other tips, or shall we ask?
I would be happy to take some questions.
Yeah.
If anyone has them.
All right. So please feel free. You can unmute yourself and just ask your question. It sounds like there are none. All right. Well, that's okay too. Just I'm going to give you another minute to think about your own writing situation. Oh, there you go. Yes, go ahead.
I have a question about the outline part. Professor said you add the points and thinkings in the outline and then writing. But how about if you check back again and see you need to delete something or add in something, like how to do that? How to do, like, I think this point is good, but maybe it's not fit this part, or need to move to another part, like how to do that, how to judge it.
So, I mean, if you have the luxury of putting it away for a little while, I think it's a much easier way to evaluate what's good and what's not. In other words, you know, when I was in college and I was writing essays, and, you know, I usually didn't have the luxury of putting my essay away for, 4 days and then picking it back up, right? I was usually writing them and finishing them, either the night before or, the day of, and I would do quick evaluating. But for me, I found the best way to decide what's good and what's not is to get yourself some distance from what you've been writing. So I typically don't try to edit what I've been writing immediately. I usually give it some time.
If I can add to that, as far as the outline is concerned, an outline is not a contract. If you draw an outline first and you start following that outline, and in the process of writing, you realize that maybe your storyline or your argument actually goes a little differently, and you need to switch that. You have no obligation to stick to your outline. And I'm saying this now to anyone who's in my current 571. If you have an outline now and you start writing and it turns out that absolutely changes in the process of your writing, that's fine. I mean, writing is part of the process of you sort of working your way through your idea, through your argument. That happens as you write. So you can change your outline. That's the beauty. It's yours.
And then with the writing, sometimes you write and then you realize the order of things goes better some other way. The hardest part about cutting things is sometimes you write something you really like, but it really just doesn't fit.
Yeah.
Right? And then you have to get rid of it, even though you like the story that you included or the example that you included, just because it doesn't really fit with what you're doing.
And that's when it's important for you to remember that you may say that particular paragraph, it's like your baby, but it's not your baby. You can delete it and you will be fine. And
I know there's a lot of people who keep documents with all their deleted paragraphs so that, for them, they may never go back to it, but it also gives them the freedom to cut it out of what they're doing, but not feel like they got rid of it forever. And I certainly did that with certain things when I was cutting my, book manuscript down. I kept the cut pages in a draft just in case, I don't know, I decide I want to use them for something else later, or, somebody said, oh, you should really put that paragraph back in,
Yeah. Any other questions?
Earlier, you talked about writing in the morning and holding your afternoons for editing and research, but are there any other techniques that you use for not being distracted during your writing? And for example, going off on a tangent on research for something that just seemed to need some immediate work?
Yeah, part of one of the things is I sort of miss the days where you could go somewhere and not be hooked into the internet. You used to go to a coffee shop and you didn't have your access to your email when you went to a coffee shop unless you either paid to get on their dial-up service or whatever. And so that was really a luxury. Like, I would have to get up to a computer that was wired somewhere to check my email on campus.
The internet cafe.
Yeah, and I've tried, there are these programs which will block you from going on the internet while you're writing. One's, I think, is called Freedom something, and they came available at the very end of my book writing, and I found those useful. You can always overwrite it, but you could just block yourself from, because none of the things that you feel like you immediately have to look up on the internet, you really have to immediately look up, right? Or find in your notes. You can put a bracket there with a placeholder, say, go find that document, that's in the folder later, if it's going to stop your process. And I find that, and I'm not perfect at it, but if I think there's something I need to investigate and I know I can find it on the internet somewhere, then it can be a rabbit hole that then just takes me away from my writing. So anything I can do to keep my email program shut, any of the things that will you know, in the modern world that we live in, that you really, you know, make it difficult. We have a house in the Sierras, and when I first started going up there, and I would, you know, didn't have, even cell phones were spotty up there. You know, now you can, you know, hotspot it up there and work, which is both good and bad. You know, I was able to write up there without any distractions. So for me, the modern world is very distracting. So whatever I can do to, and so that's why the morning, you know, West Coast people are just not really on email, a good chunk of them, until, you know, 8:30 or 9. So if you get up and you start writing at 5, you've done 3.5 hours of work before anybody starts emailing you about stuff.
Yeah. Thank you, Miles. Any other questions? Yes, Emily.
So what's been the hardest form of writing that you've encountered, like a dissertation versus a book versus a grant?
I mean, the first time you write the big project is something that is daunting, and I think especially the transition from, and so if you're going to write a master's thesis, I think the transition from writing for class when you have a deadline to writing something where there is ostensibly no deadline unless you create it for yourself, right? You know, when you're working on your dissertation, you have a timeline in your head that you think you need to get done, but you know, that's why some people, it takes years to write their dissertation because there's no deadline. So I need some kind of deadline. So, you know, I think writing groups are really helpful. And I think now the upside of, you know, everyone connecting online is I think there are writing groups that you can be part of, you know, that are not necessarily, you know, you don't have to physically be on campus at Cal State Fullerton, you know, and just having a goal of, oh, I can't show up. If it's my day to share my writing, I can't show up with nothing. So even if it's the panic that makes you do it, it's the start that, you know, gets that part of the project going. Because I think, at least for me personally, I can be paralyzed when I'm starting something new, no matter what it is, for weeks at a time, if it feels new, different, challenging to me in some way.
You know, Emily, that brings up a great idea. Maybe we should start organizing writing groups for those of you in the MA program that are, you know, getting preoccupied or getting busy with their thesis or their projects. And even in spring semester, we could possibly organize this so that the meetups are this way on Zoom, and you all have an obligation to bring in something, you know. So maybe we can get that started in spring.
Yeah,
That would be very helpful to have somebody to like hold me accountable during that whole process.
Because this whole series began with the idea of getting, especially MA students who are on their independent work in the culminating project, to keep them going and to get them to finish. That's what it's called, the finish line. I
think that's the key. I mean, you know, in my many years of being here, the place where people get lost is when they're done with their coursework. Yeah. And if you have other things, you know, in your life that can get in the way, you know, some of the great smart students I had here, you know, finish their coursework and then never finish their MA because, I mean, one of them had like 5 kids. And so once there was no coursework, you know, the 5 kids took priority and she never finished. And it's really, unfortunate. And she even did half of the project, I think. So, wow. You know, or, you know, people who have if you have a job and you're trying to write and you live with your family and there's distractions and we're all, you know, stuck in a house right now, you know, I think the pandemic, if you're in space with lots of people, could make writing very hard.
Yeah, it's true.
I mean, I don't know about you, Volker, but
I know.
You know, the interruptions during the day, you know, while lovely, right? I love my kids, and I love there's something wonderful about being around them a lot, but it does make for a much more stop-start work experience.
Yeah, they are merciless vacuum cleaners. They suck up all your time.
Yeah.
Drew, you had a question.
Oh, yeah. So I remember like earlier we were talking about like if there's a part of a paper that doesn't work, it's like deleted. So when do I know how do I let go of like a part of for example, like if I think it's central to my argument, but I feel like after reading it, oh God, it doesn't work. How do I let go of it without much of the suffering?
Well, you do delete.
And I think that creating that extra document, Drew, sometimes can be really helpful. It's freeing because it allows you to remove it, not get rid of it, especially if you worked hard on that paragraph, right? And then you think, okay, if it's not here, does this all still work? And if it doesn't all still work, then what part of that paragraph do I need to still figure out how I'm going to have it in here, right? So how do I bring part of it in without bringing the rest that wasn't working? But I think you take it out first and then evaluate the whole and then see.
I think the challenge is often to figure out, is this a good paragraph or not? And make that decision. And I think there are a couple of ways to determine this. A paragraph may have a good point, but it may be choking it to death. If you read the paragraph and you bore yourself, and I've had this sadly happen to myself, where I read something that I wrote, and it's like, I'm not interested. That's not a good sign. So if you read it and you read it out loud, for example, and you can't get through it because reading it out loud, it sounds dreadful. It sounds uneducated, or it sounds dull. Then that paragraph needs urgent help. And the other thing is, my dissertation advisor used to, with my more difficult, challenging paragraphs, used to ask me, so what are you saying here in this paragraph? What's your point? And then I would say it, and then he'd either say, so that's the same what your previous paragraph already said, right? And then you can cross that one out. Or he said, so you just told me what this is about, then why don't you write it that way?
Yeah, Volker, that's a really good, I think when I first started writing in graduate school, I had this sense that I had to write in some kind of, and I think sometimes I read essays like this from students that, you're trying to write in a very academic language.
Yeah.
Right. And then I had a advisor who was really mostly debilitating towards my writing, because he told me I was a terrible writer, and I almost dropped out of graduate school, but haha, here I am. But one of the things that he did teach me was that he said to me, you talk so clearly, your ideas when you speak them are clear, so then why when you write them are they so complicated? And so try writing closer to how you speak, and then you can, finesse the verbs if you want them to be a little more engaging and active than what you might say. But that, when you're using a fancy word for something that can be said with a much simpler word is not the better way to write, and so that I found that to be useful.
Yeah, I think that's a really vital piece of advice to not put on a persona, to not take on a voice, and try to sound to sound scholarly. That almost never works. If you are scholarly, it will come through. If you have a clever point to make, it'll be there. But don't doll up your sentences by stretching your thesaurus. I think that happens a lot. Often I find that students have their best writing in their casual, say, journal entries when they have journal writing assignments. That's when they're very clear. But when it comes to the essay, then everything falls apart. And it becomes a forced piece.
And that's where sometimes that free writing technique can be good, because it's really about writing and not worrying about, just writing what you're thinking without evaluating, right? And then sometimes that can be better than spending your time trying to, you can craft the good sentence after you got the idea down. If the idea is good and it needs, you can write it better later, but you at least have the good idea down in its simplest form.
And read it out loud. I think I learned the most about writing when I wrote for radio. I don't think I was a good newspaper writer, but when I wrote for radio, I had to read it out loud. And then you could tell where, you interrupt your sentence with all your insertions and additions and by the ways, and it becomes really awful and horrible to get through. And if you can't read it without taking a break and stumbling, then there's something off. So reading out loud, as embarrassing as it may seem to sit in your room and read to yourself out loud, it really works.
Oh, out loud, that's the best. Also, to just helps you stumble over what is awkward.
Yeah.
All kinds of things.
Yeah. All right. Any other questions? No? All right. Well, thank you very much. Thank you for your questions and your interest. Thank you, Natalie, for taking the time on a Friday evening when lots of important things are happening.
It's good for me to not be obsessing about the election for an hour and 15 minutes.
Yeah, I think that's good mental health advice for everybody.
Yes.
All right, everybody.
Thank you all for the good questions. And my students, I'll see you in our class on Tuesday.
All right. Have a good weekend, everyone. Bye.
Okay. Bye. Thanks, Volker.
Bye. Take care.
Thank you.